Ever wonder why major directors keep circling back to Jesse Plemons? Like he's cinematic gravity? The post-Breaking Bad trajectories of its cast have ranged from respectable to relentless. Yet one performer has managed to glide, almost suspiciously smoothly, into near A-list territory: Jesse Plemons. While others dabble in prestige projects or broaden their resumes with endearing commercial work and the occasional pratfall, Plemons has spent the last decade quietly annexing the industry. His rise is often treated as a mystery, as though there must be some occult explanation for why a consistently excellent actor continues to be hired. The answer, inconveniently simple, is that he is exceptionally good at his job. This revelation shocks only those who demand a more elaborate conspiracy, preferably involving Scorsese as a covert Breaking Bad devotee who saw Todd and immediately thought, "Yes, that's my guy." Whether or not Scorsese spent his evenings binge-watching desert crime sprees, his decision to cast Plemons in The Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon did exactly what one expects a Scorsese endorsement to do. It signaled to every other director that the young man was not merely capable, but essential. From there, the filmography expanded at a steady sprint. Vice, Game Night, El Camino, Civil War, Bugonia, and an ever-growing list of projects that seem to materialize on his calendar as effortlessly as he inhabits them. Of course, there is also the long-running joke that Plemons owes half his career to serving as Hollywood's emergency Matt Damon replacement. It is a cute theory if one enjoys minimizing an actor's achievements to a casting office punchline, yet even that comparison inadvertently flatters him. Studios do not hand Damon-sized roles to performers they consider disposable. Meanwhile, fellow alumni like Bryan Cranston and Giancarlo Esposito remain ubiquitous, appearing in everything short of weather forecasts. Yet neither has captured the precise cultural and critical momentum that has propelled Plemons. Their omnipresence contrasts sharply with Plemons' steady climb, a reminder that quantity is not the same as trajectory. In short, Jesse Plemons' ascent requires no detective work. Talent met opportunity, and opportunity, often wearing a pair of Scorsese-shaped glasses, recognized it. The result is a career that has outpaced expectations, outgrown its Todd origins, and left Hollywood eager to see what role he quietly dominates next. Are you interested in what actually separates Walter and Jesse when both are shown the cost of their future? The thought experiment is simple enough. Present Episode 1 Walter White and Jesse Pinkman with a highlight reel of the wreckage they're destined to create, and ask whether they would still sign the consent form for mutual destruction. The answers, however, are far from symmetrical. Jesse, for all his early bluster and amateur hour bravado, would likely sprint in the opposite direction. Even at his most misguided, he possessed enough conscience and enough desire not to be repeatedly brutalized to recognize that this particular partnership comes with a body count large enough to qualify for its own zip code. The prospect of becoming a perennial punching bag while watching innocent lives vaporize around him would be more than enough to cancel the arrangement before the first cook. Walter White, of course, demands a more nuanced autopsy. The squeaky clean chemistry teacher of Episode 1 would undoubtedly recoil at the monster waiting inside his own skin, particularly the version that dismantles his marriage, terrorizes his family, and drives his brother-in-law toward a fatal end. Yet this same Walter, when confronted with the pot of gold at the terminus of his moral freefall, would almost certainly whisper that it was all for the family, as if repeating the mantra absolves the carnage it bankrolls. There is, admittedly, one potential deal-breaker: Hank's death. Even at the height of his empire, the later-season tyrant still balked at that cost. Expecting the timid, cancer-stricken schoolteacher of Episode 1 to shrug it off is an act of wishful revisionism. The only scenario in which he proceeds is one in which ego triumphs entirely, where he convinces himself that foreknowledge of disaster grants him the power to outsmart fate, rescue Hank, and still harvest the rewards. It would be an impressive feat of arrogance, even for Walter White. What is remarkable is the insistence that Episode 1 Walt was already a fully formed megalomaniac, awaiting only the right market conditions. The more compelling, and frankly more coherent, interpretation is that his transformation unfolded gradually, under the steady corrosion of fear, pride, and the intoxicating thrill of finally feeling exceptional. Narcissistic tendencies? Certainly. The capacity for the monstrous acts he ultimately commits? Not without years of moral erosion and a steady diet of self-delusion. The man in episode 1 would never recognize the creature he becomes, and he certainly wouldn't sign off on the finale as an acceptable price of admission. Stop pretending that meth on TV reflects the real world. It's economic science fiction. Television has never been shy about stretching reality, but few things reveal its flair for fantasy quite like the drug economics of its prestige dramas. In one memorable moment, a character purchases a tenth of meth, roughly 1/16 of an ounce, about 1.75 grams, for an eye-watering $300. At that price, the product may as well come gift-wrapped with a mint on the pillow. Of course, this is less a reflection of any real-world marketplace and more an illustration of how effortlessly a fictional drug kingpin can impose a monopoly. When the supplier controls everything from production to distribution, the laws of supply and demand politely exit the room. The audience is invited to marvel at the premium nature of the goods, the implication being that purity justifies a price tag normally associated with small electronics. Yet even within the show's own logic, the economics invite skepticism. A quantity portrayed as the bare minimum for daily survival is simultaneously treated as a luxury item, despite the fact that a tenth would yield around 15 to 20 hits, enough for an ordinary user to stretch over 2 to 4 days. The narrative wants the drug to be both ruinously expensive and endlessly potent, a combination that serves drama far more than plausibility. This inflated pricing does have one convenient side effect. It helps explain why fictional portrayals of addiction so often resemble a demolition derby of desperate acts. If sustaining a habit truly demanded several $100s a day, one could hardly blame individuals for regarding copper wiring or unsecured car windows as opportunities rather than infrastructure. In reality, street prices for meth trend dramatically lower, particularly outside the glossy universe of meticulously laundered criminal empires. The disparity underscores a familiar truth about prestige television. When accuracy conflicts with drama, accuracy loses. Viewers are asked to accept a world where every user consumes artisanal narcotics and every dealer operates with the casual omnipotence of a boutique tech CEO. It is a compelling narrative device, just not a believable economic model. Stop searching for a moment where Gus shows respect for Walt. It doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. The debate over whether Walter White's paranoia was justified tends to overlook one inconvenient truth. The series goes out of its way to show that Gustavo Fring viewed Gail Bedecker as the better long-term investment. Gail was the dream employee, brilliant, obedient, and blissfully free of the volcanic ego that made Walt both indispensable and intolerable. The moment Gail could reproduce Walt's formula without supervision, the countdown clock on Walt's life effectively began. The show is not subtle about this. It practically lights the path with neon arrows. The counter-argument insists that Walt's actions were driven not by fear of Gus, but by the ongoing crisis known as Jesse Pinkman, whose talent for creating disasters included threatening Hank's life, cooking unsupervised, and dangling the possibility of turning informant whenever the mood struck him. In this reading, Walt eliminated Gail primarily to keep Jesse from self-destructing in a way that would inevitably drag him down as well. The fact that this solution required committing murder is treated, within Walt's logic, as a regrettable but tidy form of problem solving. Some cling to the idea that Gus never explicitly announced plans to kill Walt, as though Gus Fring were the type to leave written notices about impending executions. His assurances to the cousins that Walt could be theirs when business is concluded are dismissed as strategic theater, a bluff meant to placate volatile cartel enforcers. In this version of events, Gus supposedly maintained a kind of professional regard for Walt, an admiration that, if true, must have been expressed in the unique language of icy stares and heavily armed supervision. Yet the larger pattern is unmistakable. Gus was building a system that required stability, not genius. Gale provided the former in abundance. Walt offered only the latter, and only as long as he remained alive. Replacing him wasn't a question of if, but when. Walt's fear was not a delusion. It was an accurate reading of the organizational chart he was rapidly sliding off of. The tragedy, of course, is that Walt did not need Gus to threaten him directly. He simply needed to understand how men like Gus operate, and on that point, the show remains emphatically clear. Jesse Pinkman's teenage persona isn't tragic or heroic. It's far more ordinary than fans admit. The mythology surrounding Jesse Pinkman often imagines him as either a misunderstood hidden gem or a tragic social reject fated for the meth trade. Reality, at least the fictional one, lands in a far less glamorous middle ground. Despite flashes of charm in adulthood, Jesse's adolescent social life was never built on a foundation of popularity. His circle consisted of amiable underachievers who migrated from casual weed to significantly harder substances. They weren't academic prodigies, nor were they the swaggering architects of school social hierarchies. They were simply the kids who spent more time debating sci-fi minutiae than contemplating a future. Badger alone could have been the poster child for the enthusiastic but directionless teen demographic. Jesse himself was not the reigning monarch of any cafeteria kingdom, yet he wasn't languishing in complete exile either. He had just enough charisma, good looks, a relaxed demeanor, and a willingness to drift between cliques to avoid being pigeonholed as a full-fledged outcast. And yet he lacked the confidence, ambition, and social fluency that define true popularity. He existed in that familiar adolescent limbo, tolerated, occasionally liked, rarely taken seriously. This middle-tier existence neatly foreshadows his early behavior in the series. His inability to stand up to stronger personalities, his comedic physical confrontations with Walter White, and his susceptibility to manipulation all echo a history of being everyone's amiable, underestimated slacker. His street smarts, often exaggerated, evaporate the moment he steps outside his comfort zone, such as the brilliant decision to steal meth and flee from Tuco Salamanca, a maneuver that redefines the boundaries of suicidal impulsivity. Contrast this with Walter White's flashbacks, which portray a younger man who once possessed confidence, intellect, and social allure in ways Jesse never did. Walt, in his youth, embodied the prototype of someone with options. Jesse embodied the prototype of someone drifting wherever inertia pushed him. If Jesse represents the familiar high school archetype of the understated stoner who could have been brilliant had effort ever seemed appealing, the comparison invites one final, unsettling question. If that's Jesse, then what on earth would the teenage incarnation of Todd have looked like? One shudders to imagine. Anyone trying to understand why strong, reasonable women get vilified on television should take another look at Breaking Bad's final seasons. The perennial outrage over Skyler White remains one of the more revealing case studies in how audiences choose their villains. Across Breaking Bad, her actions are consistently rational, almost tediously so, given the chaos unfolding around her. She protects her children, protects herself, and responds to escalating criminal absurdity with the kind of pragmatic alarm any functioning adult might display. Yet she was branded the show's great irritant, a narrative obstruction to the mythic rise of the self-anointed alpha male at the center of the story. The audacity of expecting Walter White to face consequences apparently registered as an unforgivable offense. Accusations that her unpopularity is just sexism are dismissed by some as oversimplified, but the alternative explanations are hardly more flattering. Audiences notoriously recoil from characters who cheat or who insert inconvenient morality into a protagonist's fantasy arc, regardless of how realistic or necessary that resistance may be. In this case, the discomfort was simply louder because the resistor was a woman. The series dared to place a competent, intelligent mother between viewers and their preferred outlaw wish fulfillment, and the backlash wrote itself. Age and hindsight have softened little about the narrative itself, but they have radically reframed its reception. A decade after the finale, the original ire toward Skyler looks less like legitimate critique and more like a tantrum thrown on behalf of a collapsing male ego, Walt's, and evidently many viewers. His manipulations become unmistakable with time, his descent far less tragic genius, and far more petty destruction. The supposed villainy of Gus Fring, another casualty of Walter's insecurity, seems equally flimsy in retrospect. His empire was built over decades, only to be detonated in record time by a man convinced he deserved to be king. Meanwhile, Skyler White, competent, perceptive, and entirely correct, endured the audience's scorn for the unforgivable act of making sense. If anything, the character's legacy exposes less about her and far more about the expectations placed on women in narratives that glorify men who set the world on fire and call it empowerment. Never assume competence is enough to survive when everyone around you is drunk on pride. The death of Steve Gomez lands with a force the series seems almost too proud of. It's presented as collateral damage, yes, but the term hardly captures the sting of watching the one man who spent years absorbing Hank Schrader's bluster, temper, and condescension end up sprawled in the desert as the first visual of an episode designed to dismantle everything the audience thought was solid. If the moment feels disproportionately tragic, that is because Gomez was the rare figure in law enforcement who embodied actual loyalty while surrounded by men convinced their instincts were infallible. Throughout the series, Gomez shoulders Hank's cutting remarks, abrupt shutdowns, and periodic tantrums with the patience of a seasoned saint. He remains steady, professionally competent, quietly supportive, and unfailingly present, even when shoved aside. That steadiness, of course, earns him the ultimate punishment: being dragged into Hank's final, spectacularly ill-conceived lone wolf charge. Hank marches into an operation requiring an army with nothing more than hubris and a single trusted partner, apparently convinced that courage, his preferred euphemism for arrogance, constitutes tactical planning. His downfall mirrors Walter White's in miniature, pride masquerading as genius until the desert corrects the record. Hank's fate is poetic. Gomez's is simply cruel. The series milks that cruelty with precision. Opening on Gomez's body is not subtle, but it is brutally effective. An immediate announcement that the world built over 5 seasons is collapsing under the weight of every ignored warning, every rash decision, every man who assumed he was the smartest in the room. There remains an itch the show never scratches: the aftermath, the institutional fallout, the funerals, the families attempting to piece together a life after the desert has taken its due. An epilogue exploring that emotional and bureaucratic wreckage would have provided a chilling coda. The existing ending is exceptional, but the narrative doors left closed still rattle. What the series does excel at, however, is its depiction of law enforcement camaraderie. The gallows humor, the coded shorthand, the unquestioned solidarity. It's why the absence of even one voice of caution in the lead up to the ambush feels like a particularly dark inside joke. Between Hank, Gomez, and Jesse, someone might have wondered whether their target, famous for being 10 steps ahead, had prepared something explosive. The irony, of course, is that Walter had prepared nothing. The danger materializes anyway, summoned not by criminal brilliance, but by the fatal combination of overconfidence and narrative inevitability. Gomez was too competent, too decent, and far too loyal for the chaos swirling around him. His death may have been collateral, but it was also the show's way of reminding viewers that righteousness offers no immunity, especially when paired with someone else's pride. Subscribe